As a professor of urban and regional planning here at Florida State University, I primarily teach and do research in the areas of planning for marginalized populations and less developed areas. One of the first things I learned in graduate school was that the purpose of planning was to protect the health and safety of the population. Now, this seems like a fairly clear directive, but when you try to implement this, it turns out it's much more tricky than that. The key is, who has the power to decide? Are decisions made by technicians and scientists, or are decisions made by some form of majority rule, or some other process used by politicians? In the 19th century, John Stuart Mill identified a special form of oppression that he called the tyranny of the majority. He argued that the sheer weight of numbers could never make an unjust act any more just. By extension to planning, if a decision is made, a planning decision is made based on majority rule that harms a minority population, that decision cannot be considered just. June Manning Thomas, a professor at Michigan, has studied the horrendous effects of urban redevelopment in the 1960s and 70s on the African American population. She argues that city improvement in the face of racial oppression is racially oppressive. Think about that. I would argue that we need to extend that concept of tyranny and think about something what I call the tyranny of gender. As a transgendered woman, an open transsexual, I have experienced the tyranny of gender nearly every day of my life. When I was 4 years old, I knew that I was male, but I also knew in a very fundamental way that I was supposed to be a girl. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it was true. I used to play dress-up whenever I was at my grandmother's house with my girl cousin, and we'd wear my grandmother's old funny dresses. And I felt so real, so much like myself. And yet, I knew that I shouldn't share this. While I had clarity at a young age that I desperately wanted to be a girl, I knew that it wasn't safe for me to share those feelings with others. I was already teased by other kids in the neighborhood and other kids at school who thought that sometimes I did things that was a little too much like a girl. I didn't want to give them any further ammunition to torment me. So I kept silent and didn't talk about what my issues were. In retrospect, I realize that this was my first exposure to what I call the tyranny of gender. The tyranny of gender are those rules that we heard earlier about boys should wear blue and girls should wear pink. And if you violate the tyranny of gender, you'll be subject to torment, to teasing, to taunting, threats of violence, and perhaps physical violence actually perpetrated on your body. This is how women have been controlled for generations. This is also how gay and lesbian people are controlled if their behavior is a little gender non-normative. But I would argue that the tyranny of gender falls most heavily on transsexual and transgendered people like myself, who every day of our lives exhibit different gender difference. And the tyranny of gender makes us feel how the disapproval of society. I continued to struggle with the tyranny of gender throughout high school and college. There was no place for me to explore my feeling of gender difference, so I kept quiet. And in fact, as soon as I could, I grew a full male beard. A beard is a great disguise. You can grow a full beard and no one knows what's going on inside. And no one knew what was going on inside me. They had no clue that I was transgendered. After college, I joined the Peace Corps in a country called Togo in West Africa, and I did construction work. And nobody had a clue of what I was feeling inside. When I finished Peace Corps, I went to planning school and studied urban and regional planning. And then I came here to FSU in 1989 and worked as an assistant professor. But I still struggled with my gender issues. In 1997, although I survived the ordeal that they call the tenure process, I fell into a very deep depression because of all the hiding that I had been doing. In fact, it felt to me like suicide was my best way out. I was very fortunate that I had a very good therapist who got me on some antidepressants, and I had a small circle of friends who knew about what I was going through, who kept me from harming myself. And for that, I am very grateful. However, many of my transgendered brothers and sisters, more than 40% in a recent study, have attempted suicide. I was nearly one of those statistics. I realized that in order to heal myself from the tyranny of gender, I had to end my isolation. I had to get out and meet other people like myself. And in the late 90s, there were no other people in Tallahassee that I knew of who were like myself. So I looked for support groups. I found a support group and decided to go. I checked into the motel where the group was meeting clandestinely. I went into my room, put on my wig, dressed as the woman I knew myself to be, opened that motel room door, and in terror had to make 5 steps to the next room where the support group was meeting, and that was the longest journey I have ever made. But you know, I opened that door, and I've not looked back since then. I came back to Tallahassee, and I said, I've got to find more opportunities. I have to find a safe space in which I can explore what it is to me to be a woman, and how do I interact with other people. I found that in many major metropolitan areas, there are conventions where transgendered people will gather in the hundreds and take over a hotel, creating safe space. I went to the Southern Comfort Convention in Atlanta and had that experience. You could walk into the Midtown neighborhood, which is a primarily gay area, or was at the time, and go walking on the streets as the woman I knew myself to be, and no big deal. I could go into the LGBT bookstore called Outright Books, and this is what I looked like at that first support group meeting. And I could go into Outright Books and browse for books, and it was like, oh, okay, there's a trans woman, that's cool. At night, I could go to the Backstreet nightclub and go dancing. These were transformative experiences for me. But as an urban planner, as an academic, I was fascinated. How are these places created? What makes these cities safe? And how can I work to make sure they're preserved and made more widely accessible? I came back to Tallahassee again, and I knew that I needed to come out to my colleagues. I began that process, and they were shocked, as everyone else I've told has been, but okay. I began reading in the geography of gender and sexuality, and a whole new world of academic inquiry opened for me. I told one of my former senior colleagues that I also wanted to transition my research agenda and begin studying transgender issues. He wasn't so sure about that. He didn't see that there was a connection between transgender issues and urban planning, and besides, he didn't think it could ever be published. I realized that I was feeling once again the tyranny of gender, but this time I resolved to resist, and I have for the remainder of my career. It's important to realize that the tyranny of gender is not just about internal oppression, but it has a very physical form. As an openly transsexual woman, fairly large with a deep voice, I have lots of run-ins with people who find it very difficult to deal with my difference. I've been screamed at. I've been called names. I've been demeaned. One time in a classroom, I was giving an exam, and some undergrads kicked open the door of my room and yelled, "She-male!" Nice, huh? I felt badly for the students who were taking the exam. But only rarely have I been physically confronted. One time, in an elevator in a hotel, a drunk came up to me and tried to fondle my breasts, leaving me violated, in a state of shock. But I was lucky because I was okay. Unlike many of my transgendered brothers and sisters, who every year we commemorate on the National Transgender Day of Remembrance on November 20th, who have been grotesquely murdered. I was not. I guess I am indeed lucky. So I came back and I determined that I needed to begin studying this. But the transgender population is a very difficult population to study. There are no official sources of statistics. So you have to use something that in social science we call a snowball sample. I went back up to Southern Comfort and passed out surveys to all the attenders at this convention. And what I found is that 39% of these transgendered folks had experienced aggressive and hostile staring. 22% had experienced the kind of verbal harassment that I have, and 17% had experienced actual violence. In a nationwide study that used a similar technique, 50% had been verbally harassed and 25% were victims of violence. And finally, in Philadelphia, the city that I come from, another study found that 50% of the transgendered respondents had experienced violence. These numbers are appallingly high. The National Coalition of Anti-Violence Programs has been collecting data on hate crimes against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered people, LGBT, and their locations. As an urban planner, I'm very interested in location. Now, what's very interesting about this statistic is that nearly 30% of the hate crimes occur in private homes. And I can imagine that there are two possible major sources of these hate crimes. One might be parents who are enraged at the non-normative sexualities and genders of their children and commit hate crimes against them. Horrible to think about, but it happens. The other source is some kind of domestic spousal abuse, where a spouse finds something out about their spouse and commits a hate crime against them as well. Both of these are private acts in private homes, and planning doesn't have much that we can do to protect them. However, planning can speak to workplace discrimination, to discrimination and violence in public areas, in schools, in public accommodations, in public transit, LGBT spaces, bars, and clubs. In my experience, the most visible and safest places for LGBT people are in the gayborhoods, the gay villages that occur in most large metropolitan areas. Unfortunately, these are under great pressure from gentrification because they've gotten kind of cool. They have a cachet. So what's happening is land prices are going up, rents are going up, and the young queer people who need those spaces in order to explore their gender and sexuality can no longer afford to live there. Businesses are closing. These places are under great threat. Cities must take steps to preserve these very special areas. Planning documents need to give equal recognition to LGBT neighborhoods, gayborhoods, as they do to ethnic neighborhoods. We've got little Hanoi, we have little Havana. We should have little gay town as well to make places safe. Unfortunately, most gayborhoods are dominated by white gay men. If you're a white transsexual woman visiting, okay, you're tolerated. If you're a lesbian, a little less so. If you're a person of color, even less so. And if you're a person of color who happens to be transgendered, you're not welcome at all because you're probably a sex worker. This is true. This is what's happening in neighborhoods. I would argue that cities also need to take measures to provide affordable housing at the periphery and in gay villages so that a more diverse array of people can afford the safety that is accorded there. A common way to encourage a more inclusive urban area is for city councils to pass anti-discrimination ordinances based on sexual orientation. If they also include gender identity and appearance, then transgendered people will be protected from discrimination in housing, social services, and employment. The employment piece is very important because 78% of transgender people in a grant study of injustice at every turn said they had experienced discrimination at work. Now, contrary to the popular misperception that most transgender people are engaged in sex work, which they are not, however, if they are fired from their jobs or are unable to get a job because they're kind of different, how else are they going to support themselves? The most critical measure for transgendered people is to ensure proper access to bathrooms. In the 19th century, there were no public restrooms for women, and women had a very hard time moving through the city. The same thing is going on with transgendered people today. 68% of transgendered people in another survey by Jody Herman at UCLA found that had experienced verbal harassment in gender-segregated restrooms. This is a huge constraint on our ability to simply move across the city. To make matters worse, there are legislators across the country who are now taking up this issue of bathroom safety. Evidently, women and children are in great danger if they happen to pee in the stall next to mine. I guess I'm a pretty dangerous character. These kinds of witch hunts are reminiscent of Joe McCarthy's Red Scare in the 1950s with the House Un-American Activities Committee, reminiscent of the work that Charlie Johns did in the state of Florida with his Special Investigative Committee, where he tried first to intimidate the NAACP, and when that didn't work, he went after homosexuals in the universities and schools. Both of these men have been discredited. It's time for this kind of a witch hunt using transsexuals as a shibboleth to end. Ultimately, we must recognize that urban planning is at best a blunt instrument to preserve the safety of minority populations. I have written elsewhere that the transgendered are the canaries in the coal mine. And by that I mean that when transgendered people are harmed and harassed in public spaces, this is the tip of the iceberg of urban intolerance. Planning can make spaces more safe, but ultimately we must change attitudes. If each of you listening to this talk or watching this talk, however you access it, resolve to go back and talk with your family and your neighbors about gender diversity, it's not so scary, and think about ways you can make your communities more welcoming and accepting, we can end this epidemic of hatred and intolerance. Thank you very much.